So with that being said, my name is Jonathan Kerman. I direct the Interventional Pulmonary Program at the Medical College of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. We're a 700-bed tertiary care academic medical center. And I'm going to be discussing cost of single-use bronchoscopes and their organizational impact. Here are my disclosures. The two that are relevant to this talk are my relationships with AMBU and Boston Scientific. Here's the agenda for what we'll be going over today. First, the basics of health economics, then health economics of actually introducing single-use bronchoscopes. And then we'll touch on the organizational impact that this introduction can have, as well as summarizing the key points at the end. So let's get started with the basics of health economics first. So I just want to get everyone on the same page with exactly what I mean when I talk about health economics, because this is the foundation for a more in-depth discussion on cost. So health economics, to be specific, is the application of economic theory and empirical techniques to the analysis of decision-making with respect to health and healthcare. And it's important in determining how we improve health outcomes. It gives us the ability to provide better healthcare for more people. And most importantly, it forms a foundation for optimal resource allocation. In contemporary economic analyses, what's considered the best approach for determining the economic impact that a new technology or a new product is going to have is the microcosting approach. And what this is a formal way of dissecting all of the costs and expenses that go into a particular procedure, product, or technique. So oftentimes we will think about capital equipment. That's kind of obvious. So in this case, that's your bronchoscopes, your racks, your reprocessors. But then we don't always consider reprocessing and repair and maintenance. And with reprocessing, as Sonali mentioned, there's a lot that goes into it. Full PPE, all of the cleaning products, so detergents, the water that is actually used, as well as the brushes, sponges, and cloths that are used to clean all of these devices. And then repair and maintenance is probably the one that is most underappreciated. And this is going to vary among institutions, but the best way to assess it is oftentimes looking at prior repair reports, how many repairs you've had and how much those have cost, and the average time that it's taken for those repairs to occur, because there's an opportunity cost here as well. And so again, microcosting is really the most precise way of collecting cost data because it is comprehensive. And the focus here is the incremental cost relative to the alternative. So in this case, it's the incremental cost of a reusable or a flexible bronchoscope relative to the baseline. And then microcosting studies are good because they can estimate cost savings when you look at the difference between one product and the other. So it's that difference that is key. All right, now let's continue on to the health economics of actually introducing single-use bronchoscopes. This has been looked at in a number of different studies. Here are three that have come out within the past 5 years. And these are studies from Singapore, France, and the UK. And they looked at the total incremental costs of using, or sorry, the total incremental cost of actually introducing a reusable flexible bronchoscope into the ICU in the first two studies and into the OR in the third study. And what they found was that the cost per procedure with a reusable flexible bronchoscope ranged from $318 per procedure to $351 per procedure. And in each of those studies, they were able to calculate a financial savings by shifting to single-use products, ranging from $17 per case all the way up to $81 per case. And when you multiply that by the number of cases that are performed annually in a large hospital, that can really start to add up to significant savings very quickly. In addition to these actual real world studies, there have also been different modeling studies that have been conducted. This is a cost utility analysis that came out about 2 years ago. And they compared single-use flexible bronchoscopes to reusable flexible bronchoscopes from a UK National Health System perspective. And they used a decision tree model for bronchoscopy procedures, specifically in the ICUs. And what they found was that single-use flexible bronchoscopes, SFBs, are associated with a cost savings of over 200 pounds per case, as well as actually a small gain in quality adjusted life years. So that's kind of a nice added benefit in this case. Now, all of the studies that I've mentioned so far have focused on either the ICU or the operating room. We haven't really delved into the bronch suite too much. Last year at the ISPOR meeting, which is the International Society for Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research, data was presented for the first time on microcosting actually in the bronchoscopy suite. And in this study, they looked at a university hospital in Denmark, and they identified incremental cost savings of 133 euros per case with single-use flexible bronchoscopes. And based on an annual procedural volume of about 700 cases per year, they were able to project over a 90,000 euro cost savings on an annual basis. And that's when you factor in things like capital costs, repair costs, overhead costs, as well as reprocessing costs. So all of those ancillary costs really start to add up. Now, I know that I've mentioned, the capital equipment expense as well as the reprocessing expense, but another significant expense area is repairs. And this is one that is often underappreciated. More data are emerging on the extent of repair costs and, more importantly, the variability of repair costs. These are 3 studies over the past 4 years. The first one is from France, and the second 2 are from the US. And these are published data looking at the average repair costs of bronchoscopes. And these are just regular bronchoscopes, not any EBA scopes. In the French study, they looked at the use of bronchoscopes in multiple settings within a single university hospital. So scopes being used in the ICU, OR, bronchoscopy suite. And they found an average repair cost of about $2,500. In the first American study, they looked at 4 different hospitals actually, and multiple settings within each facility. And they found a repair cost range of about $3,300 US to a little over $5,000. And in a more recent study published by myself and my partner, we looked at bronchoscope repair costs for bronchoscopes strictly used in the ICU setting in our facility, and we had repair costs that were significantly higher. In fact, they were over $13,000 per scope per year on average. Now, let's shift over to the organizational impact. So the organizational impact first drew attention in 2016. And the 2016 study was all about identifying all of the different areas in the hospital that would be impacted by the introduction of single-use flexible bronchoscopes. And they identified these different categories, 12 in fact, that are listed here on the right: logistics, architectural and infrastructural design, budget allocation, accessibility, working conditions, vigilance and monitoring methods, modes of cooperation and communication, training requirements and skills needed, type and level of involvement of the patient and care, patient flows, patient pathways, and then work processes as well. And then the next step occurred a couple years later in 2018, where they actually delved into determining how single-use flexible bronchoscopes actually impacted each of these categories relative to their reusable counterparts. And they did this by developing a series of questions pertaining to each of these categories. And then they posed those questions to the different constituents involved with bronchoscopy. So doctors, nurses, administration. And ultimately what they did for each of those categories was determine whether single-use flexible bronchoscopes or reusable flexible bronchoscopes caused the least burden upon being introduced to the organization. And they found that in 75% of those categories, so 9 out of 12, single-use flexible bronchoscopes were actually associated with less burden to the organization overall. And in the remaining 25% of those categories, the burden was equivalent between the single-use flexible bronchoscopes and the reusable counterparts. So those three equivalent categories were budget allocation, accessibility, and type and level of involvement of the patient slash carer. Interestingly, in the hospital in which this study was performed, which was a large university French hospital, they found that single-use flexible bronchoscopes were actually a bit more expensive for them, but the hospital actually, after this study, still converted to the use of single-use flexible bronchoscopes simply because of the positive organizational impact it would have. The fact that it would be so much less burdensome to the organization as a whole was enough to outweigh some of the economic impact. So now I just want to shift to the key points. So number one, microcosting. This is a great tool for understanding the cost and setup. So when you're talking about the impact of introducing single-use flexible bronchoscopes to an organization, microcosting will allow you to truly assess your current cost of your reusable flexible bronch program. And to that point, there will be new data coming out looking specifically at microcosting within the bronchoscopy suite. And those preliminary data are going to be revealed at the upcoming ISPOR meeting in Vienna in November. And that involves 3 US hospitals where we did microcosting analyses for busy bronchoscopy programs, and we focused on the bronchoscopy suite. Number 2 is the organizational impact. This can't be overstated. Costs are important, but costs are one component that should go into the decision-making process. As I mentioned in that last study, in certain instances, the cost of reusable bronchoscopes may be greater than their reusable counterparts. That's not typically the case, but it may be in some instances. But still, the organizational burden decrease that you get with reusable scopes may be enough to prompt that conversion. And then finally, when you're looking at data when it comes to reusable flexible bronchoscopes, and single-use flexible bronchoscopes. It's important to focus on high-quality economic analyses, namely those that employ a microcosting approach, since that's the most accurate. And some of the older literature doesn't necessarily do that. So it makes it difficult to compare some of the older economic literature with the more contemporary studies. Here's the references for the different studies that I cited. This is the hospital at which I work, and this is my work email. Please feel free to reach out if there's any further questions.